also say before we start, I also want to mention that there has been a change in next week's panel discussion. We've got another philosopher signed up who is just logged into this discussion. Sylvia Winmacher will be one of the philosophers in next week's discussion. So when we send out the announcement for that, there will be a change. Let's start with Janan, and I'll push my stopwatch. Janan, you have 10 minutes. You can share slides if you want to, but obviously you can't share very many.
Okay, first, thanks for having me. And I'm going to talk pretty fast, but cut me off whenever whenever my time is done. So I'm going to start actually with the question, the last question that you asked, which is why philosophers talk about the principle and statisticians don't. So I think one really has to understand the history, the philosophical history against which Lewis's original paper in which the principle was introduced, why that paper had the impact it did. So one of the central questions in the metaphysics of science has always concerned the status of modal notions, so laws, causes, dispositions, and capacities. At the time that Lewis was writing, the debate about these notions had settled into two broad classes of views. So there were the Humeans on the one side, who held that these modal notions were reducible to patterns in the mosaic of actual fact. And on the other hand, there were the anti-Humeans. And for the Humeans, the world just consists of what happened. So one thing and then another, arranged in a four-dimensional manifold of events. For the anti-Humean, all of these modal notions govern and explain those patterns. So Lewis had developed a kind of powerful framework for articulating the difference between the Humean and the anti-Humean position, and he'd provided successful reductions, at least by his light and by the lights of many of his followers, of laws and causation. But in his own mind, the program of Humean metaphysics, the hope of reducing all of these notions to patterns in the mosaic of fact, hinged on the possibility of providing a Humean reduction of chances. And the paper in which he introduced the principle laid out an argument that no such reduction was possible. So he called that problem the big bad bug, and he pinned the hopes of the Humean program on a solution to that problem. The principle was one of the premises in the argument that no reduction was possible, but it wasn't meant actually as a substantive metaphysical claim so much as a platitude that implicitly defined what the chances were. So the idea was that whatever the chances are, that is, whatever explicit metaphysical account you give of chance, they have to be the kinds of things that could play the role, Lewis thought, outlined in the principle. They have to be the sorts of things that it would make sense to say guided credence in the way that he wrote down in the principle. So it wasn't supposed to be something controversial or contentious. It was supposed to be something taken for granted by practitioners. People started playing around with the principle, so offering different formulations, not because they were trying to, sort of argue about the precise way in which chance could guide credence, but because they were trying to find some leeway for saving the Lewisian metaphysics. Okay. So as you said in your sort of little blurb for the panel, Lewis did revise his initial formulation of the principle in a 1998 paper by accepting what came to be called the new principle, proposed by Ned Hall, a graduate student at the time. But even Lewis recognized the reformulation as revisionary of our ordinary concept of chance. So he thought that the principle really had the status of a platitude, continued to think so. So later people tried different reformulations, but the point of the reformulations, again, wasn't that anyone really doubted that chance should guide credence. They were just looking to rescue the Humean metaphysics by playing with the details. So the fact that statisticians don't talk about the principle, that is the fact that is treated by them as a platitude and something that doesn't need to be justified, is entirely what you would expect. if the principle did what it was supposed to do, namely make explicit a platitude about chance so uncontroversial that anybody who understood the notion would accept it, then it shouldn't be even worth mentioning in kind of the practitioners' discussions of chance. Okay, so moving on to the other questions. So you give us this character Tip, who is supposed to express the typical statistician's view, and what Tip says is that the only use for subjective probabilities is to combine them with utilities to make decisions that would maximize subjective expected utility. And then the law of large numbers suggests that over the course of many such decisions, your average achieved utility would be maximized by using objective probabilities and calculations. And you ask, is this reasoning sound? So there are two parts to Tip's view. One is the claim that the only use for subjective probabilities is to combine them with utilities to make decisions that maximize subjective utility. And the other is the claim that the justification is given by the law of large numbers. Okay. So prima facie, I think there are two immediate objections to Tip's view that would occur to a philosopher. One is that the first part of this seems too strong. It assumes that we have no purely epistemic goals or practices. So I have subjective probabilities about all kinds of things that play zero role in decisions as far as I can see. Subjective probabilities about who killed John Benet Ramsey, about whether Harry and Meghan were going to get divorced at some time in the future, about what happened to that bike that I had that disappeared from my backyard 2 decades ago. So pretty much anything I have a belief about, I have a subjective probability about. And some of these play no immediately obvious role in guiding action. On the second part of Tip's view, this idea that the law of large numbers is going to do the justification in the form that Tip argues, I think it actually falls short of a justification. The law of large numbers could provide a justification for letting chance guide belief in cases where I'm gambling, for example. That is where I have repeated trials and I'm maximizing average utility over some long run. But what does average achieved utility over the really long run have to do cases where I have cases where I have just a single trial? So I have to make a choice about whether to have the risky surgery or take my chances with a less invasive but less potentially effective treatment. And I care about the single case, the here and now. When I'm using chances to guide my choices about things like this, I'm not maximizing average utility across any collection of trials. I'm maximizing expected utility in this case. And it's the gap between those two things, I think, that a philosopher would say needs justification. Okay. So you ask, third question you ask, can Tip's reasoning help us choose among formulations of the principle? Okay, so this is an interesting question. Once you start treating different formulations of the principle as credence chance norms, and you take a functional view of probabilistic reasoning of the kind that's implicit in the idea that you attribute to Tip, that understanding credence or subjective probability should be done in terms of its role in decision, then you can raise questions about which of these principles, the principle, alternative formulations of principle, best serves that function. There is some recent discussion, so discussion by Richard Pettigrew and by a paper of his with Teitelbaum. Pettigrew's book, by the way, is called Accuracy and the Laws of Credence, that raises the question of justifying the principle. And here's what he says. He says, quote, no attempt has been given for different formulations of the principle as a formal justification in the way, for example, a number of attempts have been made to give formal justification of other norms of credence. He says there is no Dutch book argument for any of these principles, no calibration theorem to justify them, no analog of Cox's theorem, and he tries to fill that gap. But his justification is based on epistemic goals. So as far as I can tell, there's nothing immediately analogous to your suggestion in the reasoning that Tip gives. Okay. Final question, can Tip's reasoning be found in the philosophy literature? I think the closest connection that I see is Ramsey's definition of subjective probability. So Ramsey this will be familiar to some of you, was responding to Keynes's view about chance. And what Keynes thought was that chances should be understood as what he calls what we would call, evidential probability. So probability for him is a relation between propositions that represents the objective degree to which one proposition confirms another. It's supposed to be an objective quantity independent of our beliefs, but it's supposed to guide belief in the sense that a rational believer should apportion his or her beliefs to the evidential probability. So the idea is if you're rational and your total evidence is given by E, then the degree of confidence you should have in H is equal to the evidential probability of H given E. So Ramsey had a lot of criticisms of Keynes, but the main one was just that there just weren't enough of these evidential probabilities. So what's the evidential probability, for example, that the next raven I see is black, given that the queen has a cold, right? Instead, what Ramsey said was that we should think.
To be fair, I should call time on you,
Okay.
Janan, but I think you've actually done a fantastic job of being right on the questions when I think you've given a response to all of them. Let me say to the other 30 people in the chat, in the group, that we're hoping to leave a lot of time for questions. So if you have some questions you'd like to pose or comments you'd like to pose, and we'll set some kind of time limit on that too. We won't ask people to talk for more than a couple minutes, or maybe just for a moment to ask a question. But if you have a question you'd like to ask, if you put that in the chat, maybe my fellow organizers, Snow and Harry, could help me be sure we get attention to them. In the meantime, the second speaker on our list is Itzhak. So maybe he could jump in and give us his thoughts.
Thanks. I might be a little bit outside of this discussion, so let me just give a little bit of the background. I'll try to, from decision theory point of view, and I'll try to separate it between more or less what the field is doing and what my personal views are. So for decision theorists, the Bible is savage. Really adore it and teach it and love it. And the axiomatic derivation of expected utility, which gives both utility and subjective probability together, fall out of behavior that supposedly, if you're rational in your decision making, this is what you should be doing. Which is, on one hand, definition of subjective probability, following on Ramsey and Finetti, and maybe a suggestion by Borel, but also a way to make decisions and justify the expected utility approach to the way that it's used in economics. And most people would say that the major advantage of Savage's derivation is that the probabilities are purely subjective, that nothing is assumed there. And of course, Savage would not object to there being objective probabilities out there, but it's not assumed anywhere. He was sort of building on derivations of, the Finetti suggested a derivation of subjective probability, assuming we know what the utilities are, again, in the context of expected utility maximization. For Norman Morgenstern, just the opposite, assuming that we have probabilities deriving the utility, again, the same context. When you put them together, it seems like there is no foundation because utility needs probability to be defined and probability needs utility to be defined. And then comes Savage and both pop up from just behavior, from no numbers. A few years later, in '63, Anscombe and Aumann proved a similar theorem conceptually, but it assumed that objective probabilities are given there. And I think that most decision theorists would say that that's a major drawback, in the sense that, well, you don't get the subjective probabilities out of nowhere. You already have the objective probabilities. Mathematically, it's much less impressive because it's a simpler theorem to prove. But I've heard from Aumann over the years, maybe 3 times, and separate decades apart. it's sort of, it's late and I'm home and the cat feels that she should be good. Aumann believed that this is actually an advantage, that for them, they thought that subjective probabilities do come from objective ones, so that conceptually we first understand objective probabilities, and from that we get the subjective ones. And then you could, one of the ways to prove it also indefinite is sort of to, so indefinite you have to calibrate the subjective probabilities by these kind of decisions, assuming that indeed you want to bet on this, back to Janan's point. And in their case, it was easier because they did not assume that probabilities are given, but rather, I'm sorry, that utilities are given, but rather that the probabilities, the objective ones, are given. So the linearity they assumed was really in probabilities, and you could calibrate the two. So you could, and the point there for them was to say, well, what is subjective probability? Well, let me try to explain it to you. I mean, how many slots on the roulette will be equivalent? Oh, and then you say, oh yes, now I understand what you're talking about. Okay. So this is something that in the axiomatization is sort of built in. Still, I guess that the most people in decision theory would prefer the subjective, pure subjective one, makes no reference to anything external. And there are some people in decision theory, some leading experts who are pretty adamant about the black box thing and refuse to refer to this measure that you get from the theorem as having to do with probabilities or beliefs or anything like that. Okay, so the very extreme view just says, well, we have some kind of machinery that allows us to describe choices. As long as these choices are sufficiently coherent, we could describe them. Maybe also predict in the future, but any interpretation of utility, probability, that's besides the point. It's a bit extreme, but just to set the stage and to explain, these people are there and they're pretty leading people in the field. My personal thoughts about this brought the two things actually very close to rhetorics and the idea to the ability to convince each other. By the two things, I mean, first the term objective to begin with, and then the question of what is rational. So on objectivity, for me, I saw it again, Anscombe Baumann, this paper in '63, where they said, well, all probabilities are subjective, and if they happen to be the same, we'll call them objective. So objective is just a nickname for subjectives that happen to coincide. I've been working with David Schmeidler, who used to be my advisor for many years, and once he convinced me that this is not a very good definition. Suppose that we measure the length of this room, and you have an estimate, and I have an estimate, and they happen to coincide, so it's objective. But now suppose we also have a meter, and we actually measured it, and we can come up with the same number, but something is different. So in future works, we try to say, well, what makes it objective is that I believe that a randomly selected person from the population would agree with us. Okay, so it's still, all of it could be in my mind. It could be the only person who ever exists. But in my mind, there are these other people in society, and I'm asking myself, what will I be able to convince them of? And the objective, the way I'd like to define it there, is to say, well, objective means that not only do we happen to agree on that, but we also tend to believe that other people who would be selected from the population would agree. And this, of course, brings about the question of which population and what would they know, and would they be able to speak our language, which I think sounds very messy to theorists that we talk to, but I think is actually an advantage. I have 3 more minutes, I guess. Or almost, okay, thanks. On the other hand, something else that is usually, we just use without necessarily talking a lot about is rationality. So in modern economic theory, modern, I mean since the 1930s, economists don't say what should determine your utility, but as long as you're sufficiently coherent to be maximizing some utility function, then you're considered to be rational. So this is a bit of a postmodern step. We're not saying what is the essence of rationality, but just the form. When I joined the field, well, other theories of decision making were starting to flourish, and the question was, are they rational or not at some point? And I noticed that some people don't want to call certain things rational, and I started asking, what do they mean by that? And the best definition I found is to say, well, something is rational for a person if when you explain this decision-making mode to them, if you do the analysis, they don't feel embarrassed. They don't want to change their behavior. So just sort of robustness to analysis. And this brings about lots of problems. I mean, that's the whole thing becomes very messy and empirical. I mean, I can't just define by axioms what is rationality. I have to check, and it's going to depend on who I'm talking to and what education they have. And it's non-monotonic in intelligence, because I could have two people who make the same decisions. One of them is intelligent enough to understand my explanations and feels embarrassed. The other one's not, and they don't even feel embarrassed, so for them it's rational. But the reason I'm using that definition is that for me, it's sort of a test of what do we do when we have conflicts between behavior of psychological findings and the standards of a theory. So if it's rational for most people, which means that I can convince them, I mean, I cannot convince them that they're wrong. They feel okay with that. I have to accept it and refine my theory as a positive descriptive theory. If by contrast I could teach them and change their behavior, then maybe I'll bring them around and join my theory and my camp. So for me, it's very defined. Rationality is defined by a very practical question, highly idealized, of course, of what do I do with these conflicts and can I convince people to change their mind? And then over the years, we also changed this a little bit to say that convincing, has two sides, which I like to call objective and subjective. Subjective one, I'm subjectively rational if you cannot convince me that I'm wrong. I'm objective, something is objectively rational if I can convince you that I'm right. And again, lots of mess of who are the people I'm talking to and what they mean by convince and how do I know if they're convinced. But basically that's, but if I take these things together, then rationality and objectivity nearly converge. Okay, so it's for me, and this is my personal view, I should say, I mean, some co-authors and myself, but it's not necessarily the prevalent view in decision theory. But according to this view, which I tried, it's highly idealized, but I think of as very practical. The question is, what modes of behavior are there to stay? What modes of behavior can I convince people to change? And objectivity is about what can I convince them is, say, the right probability or whatever. So it's almost the same. I mean, there are details to work out there, but they're almost the same. But maybe I should stop here for now.
You're muted.
Yes, so that was enough time to talk. Chuck talked for 10 minutes. So let's go on. And I think next we have Stephen talking, our statistician.
Yeah, is it possible for me to share my screen, Glenn? Is that
possible? Yes. Go ahead.
How do I do that?
In the usual way, at the bottom of your screen or top, if you kind of click on the background, you should see share screen.
I see. Oh, yeah, share screen. Yeah. Okay, fine. Thanks. Do you see my slide?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So I'm going to talk about some paradoxes. And had I known that Philip David was going to be in the audience, I maybe would not have been so rash as to choose Philip's selection paradox as an example, but I will do. And just to cut to the chase, I'll give you my thesis. As a practical statistician, I'm interested in objective probabilities. But the principle seems very reasonable. I sort of feel that chances should inform credence, but it's actually less obvious how to put it into practice. One can believe that, but I'm not sure whether it gets you much further forward. So let me introduce you, if you don't already know it, to David's selection paradox. So we've got a number of treatment means from a number of treatments in clinical research, such as, I used to work in the pharmaceutical industry, a problem we might come across. We use a standard conjugate prior for the true treatment effect, having got the observed treatment effect. But Bayesian analysis is fully conditioned on the data. So this is what the posterior mean does not depend on. It does not depend on why we've chosen the treatment. We could have chosen it at random, or we could have chosen it because it gave the largest response. But quite a lot of statistical practice and some statistical intuition seems to suggest it should make a difference. So what's the explanation? Why doesn't it matter that it's the largest? So here's a possible reason. What does it actually mean to use a conjugate prior in this particular context? So what I've done is I've written down, I've plotted in red, a normal distribution, which we can imagine for this particular purpose is sufficiently diffuse. It's not particularly informative about the treatment mean. I'm going to let the data dominate, but I've got here some sort of, let's say, vague distribution, assuming the standard deviation is quite large compared to the treatment mean. But how would I ever know what that particular red curve is? So here are some examples. I might have observed previously 10 treatments in very, very large trials. I'm talking about very, very large trials here because the distribution is a distribution of a true treatment effect. So there's an easy trap to get into, fall into, and that is to imagine that the observed treatment effect tells you directly about the prior distribution. It doesn't. You'd have to somehow work out what the data variance was in order to get the right answer. So to simplify things, I'm going to assume I've got some very large trials. So I happen to have seen 10 of them. I simulated them. And you can see that the black curve, which is the smoother I've used here, doesn't actually fit the red curve very well. Okay. So how about 100 or whatever, 1,000 or 10,000, or how about increasing the number? Now you have to see that it's really rather a large number I need. So although I set out having a rather vague prior distribution, it turns out somehow to encode a great deal of information. It's equivalent to having seen an enormous number of treatment effects. And so although the distribution is not particularly informative about the new treatment, it's very, very informative about itself as a prior distribution. And now this is my solution or my suggestion as to how you can solve the paradox. If you've already seen 1 million true means, why should you care that the particular treatment that you now have is the highest of a local group of, say, 10? Because in fact, the current means that you have are completely exchangeable with your prior distribution, so it really doesn't matter. So we can set out trying to be fairly vague, but somehow we may trick ourselves into actually having used rather a lot of objective information or imagining we have. So here's another example. I want to do an analysis of some side effects. I'm investigating a treatment in rheumatism. I'm worried that it increases blood pressure. How, as a statistician, if I want to be Bayesian, would I actually choose a prior distribution? Here's one way I could do it. I could look up a nice data project, so use some objective data. The Monica project is a WHO project collaborative over many, many patients. It produced a standard deviation of 11 millimeters of mercury for diastolic blood pressure. I'm going to choose something like a prior distribution of 0 and 4 millimeter standard deviation, which is about equivalent to having seen 15 patients. So I'm actually trying to be quite modest. I'm imagining that I've not seen very many patients, but I'm using these data to guide me. Now what happens is a colleague informs me, oh, that's very well, Stephen, you chose that particular prior distribution, but now I have a large meta-analysis of treatments for rheumatism, they've taken place. This would give you a much better prior distribution. But the question now is, am I allowed to change my prior distribution? I didn't in my particular setup include any particular means of updating the prior distribution itself. It seems to be that I'm violating some particular rule of coherence if I do this, some rule of temporal coherence. Or if I allow myself to do this, why am I not allowed to do this all the time? So here are two examples where setting out to be subjective, maybe I've ended up using in some particular way, rather inappropriately, some objective information I imagine existed. Let me give you De Finetti's quality paradox. This comes from his book on probability.
Alison, I'm muted, so don't worry.
Sorry? Can you hear me still? Can you hear me?
I think you're okay. We have the noise.
All right, okay. So imagine you've got a batch of 1,000 items. A quality standard says no more than 50 defective items are allowed, and you choose 100 at random and you find that 15 are defective. What can you say about the batch? What can you say in particular about the 900 items that you haven't seen? So a way that you would standardly, if you were teaching a course on statistics, suggest this could be handled would be by using a beta prior distribution. And here are some examples with the dashed lines. And the data will clearly overwhelm these particular distributions I've chosen. And you've got there the solid lines are the three posterior curves corresponding to the prior distributions. But what De Finetti says is there's no justification for doing this. There's no reason why this should be an appropriate model at all. Imagine three possible cases. Case one, we believe the batches are packed from very large production runs have been mixed together. In that case, there's no reason why one batch should vary from another. Effectively, having taken a sample from the batch tells you nothing about the particular batch, apart from what you've actually seen. Case two, the batches are packed together from given runs of particular machines, and these tend to drift badly from their settings. That's the sort of thing where you have important batch-to-batch variability, and maybe the prior distributions we use there would be okay for this particular case. Case three, we think that the product is inspected prior to packing to ensure that no more than 50 per batch are defective. If that's the case, if you've already seen a high number of defectives, you actually think there will be fewer defectives than usual in what remains. Each of these three particular answers are perfectly logical. And so it turns out that although you have the ambition of being a practical statistician and of using data and all of that, it ends up being something else you need to know, which you don't know, which under the circumstances, you just have to subjectively feel about how the production process works. So what's my point in all this? My conclusion is, just remind me, it's almost time for me to stop. It's quite hard being Bayesian. And this seems to be true whether you set out to be subjective, in which case credence is all, and being coherent is your guide, because you may actually find that you've somehow laid claim to objective information which is unreasonable. It's not really there. Or you set out to be as objective as possible. Chance is important, and chance should guide your credence. So the rather negative personal position I would get at here is that I could sort of agree in a way that the principle is true, but does it help? I'm not sure it does. Glenn, you're on mute.
Thank you. So I was thanking Stephen, of course, and want to remind people to think about questions when we're done with the panelists, and in particular, maybe I'll first ask the panelists if they have any questions for each other. But we have one more panelist, and that's Sherry. Please, Sherry, you're on.
Okay, great. So Glenn asked, why don't statisticians talk about the principal? One reason for that might be that for the principle to make sense, one must think that there are subjective probabilities, or that rationality requires a person's degrees of belief to be probabilities. And one has to think that there are the right kind of objective probabilities to be called chances, which you might not think there are, or not in cases other than games of chance or quantum mechanics, or you might not think we could know them. Unless you accept both of these things, the principle doesn't arise. And I don't know how many statisticians do accept both these things. But supposing some do, one of the reasons philosophers talk about the principle, as Janan already said much better than I could, is something that I don't think most statisticians worry about on a daily basis, which is giving a metaphysical account of what chance is or what laws are. In this area, some people take the principle as a condition of adequacy or a desideratum for an account of what chance is or laws. In other words, whatever that account is on this kind of view, it should make the chance of A something that if the rational agent were to encounter it, it would make sense for her to update on it. It's not a trivial condition. If chances are propensities, then they don't obviously support the principle. As Laura pointed out in the paper that Glenn sent us, There's no reason to think that following those will make you more likely to have high degrees of belief in truths and low degrees of belief in falsehoods. If you take the principle as a condition of adequacy on theories of what chance is, you might be presupposing it, not arguing for it. It seems that many philosophers are assuming that something like the principle must be right and working to formulate a version of it that does come out right. So, for example, when you work to define admissibility, you're assuming that the principle is true and identifying the domain in which it's true. You could think of it that way, or the new principle, or the generalized principle, other descendants. It's like you know something like the principle is right, and you're trying to find a version of it that's compatible with other things that you think are right. For example, about laws and chance. So when you see derivations of the principle in this area, it can be at least as much a justification of the theory of chance that the derivation is appealing to as it is a justification of the principle. Even the cogency of the betting argument that Glenn gave for the principle depends on what chance is. Chance has to be related to actual frequencies for that to work. And Karl Hofer does give a betting argument for the principle in this book, but it depends on what chance is. So another reason to be interested in the principle, of course, concerns rationality. Many philosophers I know, which is in the epistemology rationality side of philosophy, think that it's obvious that something like the principle is a requirement of rationality, but they're not thinking of the decision theoretic argument that Glenn gives when they think this. I have a suggestion about why some of us think this way. The first step is that this betting argument assumes that putting more money on truths is of higher utility than putting more on falsehoods. You might say that's just part of the betting setup, and it is. But notice that it's not the case that believing the truth is always of higher utility to an agent than believing a falsehood. If you're the CEO of R.J. Reynolds in the mid-20th century, then it's of high utility to believe the falsehood that smoking doesn't cause cancer, because then you can make lots of money and suffer no pangs of conscience. To see that the betting setup, to see that the betting setup is making an assumption about the utility of truth, consider the settling of bets. In real life, things that are interpretable as bets can't always be settled by transparent outcomes, like in lotteries where a ball or a card is pulled. To be settled, a bet has to be settled at some time. And for some things we can think of as bets, we can do no better than using the best evidence at that time to settle it. Now, when R.J. Reynolds faced the lawsuits that were basically the settling of those bets they made about the safety of smoking, the settling was based on the best scientific evidence at that time. And I'm sure we all believe that the best evidence did point to the truth about smoking, but it's possible for good evidence not to do so. It could be misleading. So imagine a scenario in which the best science of the time had come down on the other side. The lawsuits got settled on the basis of the claim that smoking does not cause cancer. Actually, there wouldn't be any lawsuits because the plaintiffs' lawyers would know that they would lose. In this case, the CEO of R.J. Reynolds won his bet, and he's smiling all the way to those bank accounts that won't be plundered. You might say, that's not a real bet. Real bets are settled by the truth. Yes, in the decision theory accounts, bets are properly settled by the truth, and you win if you had more money on the truth. I have nothing at all against this. My point is just that the setup builds in that assumption that having higher degrees of belief in the truth is advantageous, or that it's what you want. Now for my explanation of why some philosophers take the principle to be obvious. If you think that it's better to have higher degrees of belief in truths than in falsehoods, which I claim the betting argument for the principle presupposes, then you don't need a betting argument for the principle. So here's why. About what chance is metaphysically, there's not a lot of agreement. But one thing that many people will say if you ask, what do you mean by chance? Is that the chances at a given time are the objective, the real, the true probabilities of events, whatever that turns out to mean. If the question of the principle arises, why should that subjective probability match the chance? Well, if you want higher degrees of belief in truth, then why wouldn't you also want your degrees of belief to match the true probabilities? And what are the true probabilities? Those are the chances. So in this sense, the principle is at least as fundamental as the betting argument for it. Whatever else chances are, they're the true probabilities of events. And if we assume that it's better to have higher degrees of belief in truths, we should also want our degrees of belief to match those true probabilities. This is provided those true probabilities are well related to what actually happens in the world. But if that's not true, then the decision theory argument for the principle doesn't work either. So that's by way of a direct argument about truth. I think that's what we have in mind when we take it to be obvious that the principle is true.
Okay, so Sherry is finished. Should I take that?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, thank all four panelists for a brief discussion of their viewpoint. Do we have any questions from the panelists to each other? Could I start that way? Does anyone want to ask a question? No, well, we do have one person who asked a question in the chat, and that's Clark. Clark, do you want to, or a question or a comment anyway, do you want to make your comment?
First, I have to unmute. I just observed that apropos of the example about wanting to change your priors, given either new information or a new hypothesis. There's a very nice discussion in Ed Lemer's specification searches of the very same point with a quite different example where the description of the cases changes rather than getting ancillary information. Just a contribution to your knowledge of the literature.
Okay. So Alex, or does anybody want to, do the speakers, panelists want to comment on what Clark said? Stephen, did you have any reaction to that?
No, that's it's nice to have the reference. I'll follow it up. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, let me introduce something more controversial, which is really about complicated issues about how these matters are decided in practice. There were 2 randomized experiments testing the effects of smoking on death. One, the Rose experiment with a relatively small sample, another, a much larger experiment with thousands of people in it, done in Britain, I believe. And both of these experiments showed no effect of smoking cessation on death. The Rose experiment was middle-aged men in their 50s who had a long history of smoking. It was a randomized trial. One group was treated to quit smoking. They didn't universally quit smoking, but the amount of smoking was very largely decreased in the treatment group. The treatment group actually, 5 years later, had a higher death rate than the non-treatment group. They died from all kinds of causes. In view, I mean, is that chance? Is that the best evidence one should place one's judgments on, as against various observational epidemiological studies that weren't randomized? Clearly, the Surgeon General decided that the randomized experiments didn't outweigh the various observational studies that matching studies in Scandinavia and other epidemiological data. So the question, the example raises, seems to me, go to the heart of the question of those who believe in the principle, which is how do I judge what is chance?
Well, let me direct a question then to our two philosophers. Clark and Stephen are looking at how statisticians might use this principle. But the way the principle is stated is sort of like, if I knew the chance, I would make it my credence. There's no assumption there that I could ever possibly know it. So is this principle something that it is sort of stated in a way that it's meant to have no possible application? Jeananne, I mean.
It's okay. So to a philosopher of physics, and this is partly what Lewis had in mind, when one speaks of chance, one's thinking of something quite specific. One's thinking of quantum probabilities. So the context in which the metaphysical question about the interpretation of chance arises is one in which our fundamental physical theories give us, they give us a quantity that's supposed to be the objective probabilities of events. And then the question is, for the metaphysician, what is that thing? So to a large extent, I think it is orthogonal to the question of how does a statistician operationalize objective probability. There's one other thing that's worth mentioning, just because the word chance is used in so many different ways, just to connect it to the principle and Lewis's discussion. So sometimes people use chance, and Heffer, for example, does this, but it's all over the literature, just to mean any type of objective probability. But Lewis specifically, and this is important for the interpretation of the principle, said it's objective single case probabilities. So it's not type probabilities, it's not conditional probabilities, it's objective single case probabilities. And what he had in mind was those numbers that are delivered by the Born's rule, for example, in quantum mechanics.
Thank you, Jeananne. Alex Meehan has put a question in the chat. Do you want to ask that, Alex?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to ask it. Yeah, this question just occurred to me, Sherry, at the end. I liked sort of the response or diagnosis you gave of why the betting argument, maybe it would go through, but in a sense it might be redundant in the sense that it would presume certain assumptions that might already be enough to get you justification of the principle. And I was just curious, in light of that diagnosis that you gave of the betting argument, if you had an opinion on the accuracy argument that Jeananne mentioned, where the idea, and I'm not too familiar with the details of that, but the rough idea of that argument being that maybe we could give some accuracy-based motivation for the principle as a norm. Because I was thinking that kind of, it was like we were granting there that being close to truth is good because of the epistemic good of accuracy, yeah. But then we still thought there was a gap between that and getting to the principle. So I was sort of interested in whether you see that as a gap really or not.
Well, actually, I had an extra slide where I was pointing you to that paper by Pettigrew, which is great. And so he's giving an accuracy-based argument for each version of the principle. And there are different arguments because each version follows, if you put in a particular assumption about chance, that goes with each version of the principle. So, I mean, it's not redundant. It's, and I was just trying to explain why people might think that the principle is obvious, and that the betting argument by itself doesn't get underneath that. It's not more fundamental. But what he's doing is, actually, he shows how the principle that you espouse is going to depend on what you think chance is. And that seems to be ineliminable. So the betting arguments that Hoffer gives in his chapter also are presupposing things about chance. It's kind of an advertisement for his view of chance, that you can derive the principle from it. So yeah, I think that's a not redundant paper.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, Philip David has his hand up, I believe.
Sorry, just to say the queue, and also people should feel free to raise hands or use type Q in the question. So and so right now the queue is Dimitri has a comment on the tip question, the first tip question that Glenn raised, and then we can go to Philip. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, Dimitri, are you there?
Yeah, hey.
Yeah.
So this is just, I was kind of looking at the thing on the PDF about Tip's approach, and I just, this isn't really related to anything that any of the panelists said, but I was kind of thinking through the proposal, and it seemed to me like there was going to be some kind of issues in defining what we meant by the long run, relative to which the kind of expectation of monetary gain and loss is going to be taken. And I mean, just like a kind of dumb and simple case, suppose that the coin was flipped yesterday, but I know that it landed heads. Well, when you ask like, well, how much money would I win in the long run, where I sort of took that bet over and over again, if we consider a long run where like the coin is flipped fairly every time and I keep taking the bet, then if I take it at very steep odds, I'm going to lose money in the long run. But presumably that's not the kind of long run we want to think about. We want to, any long run, we're going to be holding fixed some things and allowing other things to swing free. And I think that sort of like which kinds of things you want to hold fixed and which kinds of things you want to let swing free is in part going to depend upon your views about which kinds of things break the usual connections between chance and credence. And in some of the kind of cases that I've been thinking about, I feel like, it's that wiggle room is going to kind of give you different versions of the of a principle of chance deference, depending upon which things you hold fixed and which kinds of things you allow to swing free. So it was kind of like just a vague, amorphous comment on Tip's approach.
Well, since I authored Tip's approach, and maybe I'll say that I had a kind of a picture there of what a probability theorists would call a stochastic process, where every time you made a decision, it was about some different issue, but there was always the objective probability given current circumstances, and that's so those current circumstances, if you want to call it a conditional probability, given everything that's happened in the world, since we're talking objective probability. That was the picture I had. I don't know if that responds to what you're saying or not, but that's the thought I had. Did you want to say something more, Dimitri?
I guess I was just thinking that it matters what we include in your current circumstances, whether it's sort of things that you know, and whether it includes stuff about the future that you might know, or sort of things about what time it is that you might know or not. I thought
chance was including everything, and we were in some hypothetical where we knew what the current chance was. That's a picture I had.
Right, but I was thinking, you might not know what the chance is.
Oh, yes, that's the whole problem.
Things,
that's why the principle maybe seems so irrelevant to Stevenson, is that, well, you never know. You aren't in the situation where you know the chances.
But I was thinking the principle will still apply even in those cases where you don't know what the chance is. It will still constrain your credence by constraining the conditional credences.
Oh, so you're going to be a Bayesian and you're going to average over all of them. Well, I didn't know what that seemed like a different Okay. Phil, is it Philip's turn?
Okay. It seems to me there are two ways you can look at the principle. One is we assume we already have prior understanding of the terms in it, so, credence and chance, and it says how we should be relating them. And the other is that we may understand one of those terms, and the principle then maybe give us an idea how to interpret the other. I can't say I like the first interpretation very much because I, for one, don't have any prior understanding of what chance is. And we've heard, I think, quite a few different views already today about what chance might be. So from that point of view, I think the principle is actually vacuously true because its premise is simply false. But I'd like to think of the other idea that the principle gives us an idea of what we might mean by chance. So if I know what credence means, then I could say that chance is something for which the principle holds. But the trouble is that is far too weak, and a lot of other things would satisfy the principle other than objective probabilities. So think of the following example. Imagine that a lot of students are taking a lot of exams, and some of the students are bright and some aren't so bright, and some of the exams are tough and some aren't so tough. We can think of a two-way layout of, say, the rows of the students and the columns of the exams, and there's hypothetically an entry in every cell. And all these entries are filled in for large numbers of students and exams except for one, which is me, and I'm just about to take my first statistics exam. And I'm thinking, what is the chance that I will pass it? Now, I can think about all the other students who've taken statistics, who I think are kind of like me, like tossers of a coin, if you like. And I can think about the De Finetti idea, if you like, or even Bernoulli, what's the limiting relative frequency with which students pass statistics? And they say, in the absence of any better knowledge, that is my chance. Or I can think of all the other exams I've taken. Forget about the other students. I've taken lots of other exams. And I can say, well, they're all sort of much of a muchness as far as I'm concerned. I've passed 60% of these exams. Therefore, my chance is 60%. And it could have been 40% when I looked at the other way around. And there's both of these numbers would be appropriate things I could plug into the principle and say that should be my appropriate credence based on the evidence I'm taking into account at the time. Or I could even say, take account of the whole two-way array of all the other results. And it's much more complicated mathematically, but I could come up with an answer taking all that into account as well. So what we got here is something which doesn't define chance. It defines something which Chaim Gaefman called an expert assignment, something that if I knew it, I would adopt it as my subjective probability. But the problem is there are very, very many things which have that property, and it doesn't single out objective probability at all.
Okay, does anyone have a comment on what Philip said, or is there another Snow? Help me, was there somebody else in the queue?
Yeah, well, Alex has a follow-up, and I think Isaac also has a comment or a question in the chat, and also Jinan. So perhaps you can go with Alex and then Jinan. Oh, and also Sherry. Yeah, got it.
Thanks. I was just going to ask Philip, I found that a helpful example, but I guess my question is, do you think that in those cases, those chance, or what you might call a chance estimate, given those different bits of evidence, different bits of expert assignments, do you think that they're really like the uniquely rational assignments that any rational agent would have to assign given that same body of evidence? Because I sort of had the thought that in that case that, maybe different kinds of agents with different initial priors, initial starting points, given that information that they're about to take this test, and to pick one of the examples, with the one missing spot, there might be more than one possible rational assignment, in contrast to some statement like the laws, the fundamental physical laws up to now, and the history of the world is such and such up to now. That seems like something which, because it entails, what the quantum probabilities are, something that any rational agent would have to assign one specific value to. So I just wanted, as a way of maybe pushing back against this, what I'm trying to say is maybe the principle is not really satisfied in these examples, because it's not the case that any rational agent given that information would have to give that one unique assignment.
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't know quite what it means to be rational, but I know what it means to be coherent.
Right.
The two-way layout I was describing can be expressed in terms of all the rows, all the students being exchangeable. I don't have any reason to think any. I mean, I know some are bright and some are dim, but I don't know which are which, and therefore, as well, the equality of ignorance, and the same for all the exams. And then anybody who shares that opinion will have to come up with the same answers that I did. There's only one that they are uniquely determined.
Then why not say then, if that's true, that that now we have a new kind of chance, a chance, a very special sciencey, higher level type chance that's made true by these facts about how things are arranged. And then there's, of course, another kind of chance which is made true by different kind of facts, like what you've taken in the past. I mean, I see that there might be problems with that, but I'm just curious, why not just go double down and say, now there's lots of kinds of chances, and that's not a problem.
Not just lots of kinds of chances, there are lots of numerical values for the chances, depending on what I look at.
Right, but there's different chances at different times anyway. We already accept that. So anyway, I'm sorry. I'm just, I see how that might not be so comfortable for those who just want a more constrained conception of chance. So.
Jeanette?
Sorry. I think most of what I wanted to say got sorted out between Philip and David, but I guess, sorry, Philip and Alex, but the way I would put it is, that's just the old reference class problem. We have all of these, any given event belongs to a lot of different classes where the stabilized relative frequencies or the conditional probabilities vary quantitatively from one to the next. And the question is, which one do we assume, which one do we take as our subjective probability? Or if you think there is a fact about which is the objective single case probability, then you have to answer that question, given the fact that we have all of these different conditional probabilities. It's a familiar problem, but you're right about it. I mean, nobody has an answer to it.
Sherry?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I'm not sure that the principle should be taken as the only constraint on what the chances are. Just one of them. And, others might come from physics, for example, or your idea of what the laws are. So I'm not sure we should expect the principle by itself to pick out the chances exactly.
So I think Ishak is next in line. Is that correct? Yes.
This actually ties in with this. So what are exactly chances? I mean, how do, in what kind of circumstances can we define chances? I mean, I know a bit of the history, games of chance and things like that, but especially when this is why I brought up these questions, when I think about questions that might be, important, and I don't think I can see to bridge the gap between what I personally don't know about quantum mechanics, but some people do know, and war in the Ukraine or the extent of global warming. And do we have a definition of chance that could be applicable there?
And Janae, is this on the question?
Yeah, I mean, what the principle says is the chances are those numbers such that they screen off all and only any information that you could have about the past, but not the future. So the way that Lewis introduced it, right, was he said, he introduced this notion of admissibility, but effectively what the principle said is, if you know what the chance of an event is, then it doesn't matter whatever anyone else tells you. It's not going to change your probability because you already have the chance is effectively an encoding of all of the information that you could have about an event or that you could get about an event from the past. So that's an a precise implicit definition of chance, in the sense that it says the chances are those quantities such that they screen off all and only information about the past.
And can we define them for?
So it depends this is partly confusing to me. I think maybe the philosophers are using the notion of definition in a different way than the statisticians. So if you mean, can I give you what the chances are in any given case? Could I give you the number quantitatively, tell you what the chances are? The answer is no. But if you're asking, can I give you something that would uniquely pick out the chances in the sense of a metaphysical definition, in the sense that, I could uniquely pick out a certain color by saying it's the color of the bottom sock in my drawer without knowing it. So there's some fact about the world that would pick out a unique number, even if I don't know, even if I don't myself know how to fill that in, then I think Lewis's definition does try to give you a definition in that sense of a chance. It's a uniquely defining condition that, yeah.
Suppose we took it out of Lewis's imagined world, and suppose more reasonably that what we have are degrees of belief about the chances. How does the principle work then?
Can I answer this quickly? I mean, this is something that wasn't addressed by Lewis. So I did give what I call the generalized principle, which was precisely meant to answer that question. And it says effectively, that you should mix. So the way that Lewis thought of it and the way that philosophers of physics thought of it, and I assume, Clark, this is maybe what you have in mind too, is we've got a bunch of, candidate physical theories or candidates for assignments of what the objective chances are. And the question is, how do we form beliefs in that context when we don't know what the objective chances are? That's the condition that we're actually in most of the time. It's the condition that a Humean is in. And so it's the condition that one should take as the, situation for the Humean as well. And then my response was, you make a weighted mixture of all possible, epistemically possible theories of chance, where the weights are just given by credences. They can't themselves be given by chance. It's not actually a guide. It's not a very good guide in the sense it's not going to give you an objective number that you should assume as your, as your subjective probability. What it will do is diffuse the problem that Lewis was worried about.
Okay, I think we have, I think Stephen raised his hand and Philip raised his hand and Marshall put his cue in the question. So maybe Stephen.
I was just reminded somewhat of the difference between probability and statistics. And when I studied at university as an undergraduate, I did economics and statistics as my first degree. But I took a course on stochastic processes, which was quite challenging, but completely baffling, because you did the whole book by Unari and Bat, and you got a vast array of rather complicated problems in probability, but nobody ever said where any of the probabilities would come from. And as far as I can see, they were just purely religious. God would provide them, or maybe the professor. That was basically how it happened. And the vast majority of probability books are like this. There are one or two exceptions. Actually, Glenn Schaefer's book with Volodyovovsky is an exception, where the business of actually estimating probabilities somehow comes into it in game theoretic sense, if I understand correctly. And De Finetti's book is completely different. It actually addresses the business of how you would know anything to start with, and they start subjectively. Maybe Harold Jeffreys, I'm not entirely convinced, but the majority are purely in this sort of chance domain. Chance exists and we can talk about it, even though we will never actually realistically have a number to do with. So maybe from that point of view, statisticians are not particularly interested. That's why, because, you know, maybe at some level what Lewis says is true, but is it helpful? It's about as helpful as a probability book when you really want to come to do something. And actually the COVID pandemic has shown this to us. You have a lot of complicated models, but what they really need is they need some probabilities to populate them. They need some ideas as to, you know, to what extent Omicron is more effective than Delta, and to what extent the case fatality is different, and so forth. And the modeling itself, which is the realm of probability, working with these objective chances doesn't get you very far.
Phil? Thank you, Stephen. And thank you for the compliment. Philip, I think you were next.
Okay, so I want to address this issue of screening off the whole past as being defining objective chance. Now, if you think about sex ratio in births, we've got a lot of examples of births, I think, in the history of the world. And sex ratio seems to be pretty constant. And I think a lot of people would happily say that, I don't know quite what it is, a 52% chance of giving birth to a girl, for example, that if somebody hasn't yet determined the sex of their unborn child, then it's 52, the objective chance is 52% getting a girl. But if you go into real great physiological detail about the movement of the gametes and, you know, what happened and where did the sperm meet the egg, and you know, if you take all that into account, then probably, if we had that information, well, we don't, but it's part of the history of the world, and therefore that would determine the sex completely. Surely the only objective probability of having a girl is 1 or 0. The trouble is I don't know what it is, and that doesn't get me very far.
Well, we've had a couple statisticians speak. Maybe we should ask I think Marshall had a, I don't know if he's prepared to respond to those comments.
Well, what I have to say is relevant. I don't know that I have a response per se, but it's relevant to some of those comments and relevant to Yitzhak's question. So I want to start with the probability of Russia and Ukraine going to war. I'm not going to give you the number, but you know, it could be that relative to all the sort of micro facts about the world and state of every quantum, you know, every relevant quark that could affect the outcome, there is a probability, and it's probably close to 0 or 1. But that's not what Yitzhak's question was. I think it was given some higher level description of what's going on, what's the probability that Russia and either Ukraine will go to war, and is there an objective probability of that? And one answer is, well, there could be chances, there could be objective probabilities, but that doesn't necessarily mean that in every case there are probabilities. I mean, I do think that in some circumstances, you can argue that there are, relative to higher level characterizations of the world, there's something systematic about those conditions that makes it the case that there's a probability. And this is kind of this isn't really probability, but if you take a random number generator, it's a deterministic process. But in a certain sense, there's a probability of an outcome from that generator. But I don't think, you know, I think it probably is the case that with something like war between Russia and the Ukraine, there's not an objective probability, except in this sort of very low level sense that makes it a chance of 1 or 0. At a higher level, why does there have to be a probability, an objective probability of everything? And in some cases, there may be, I think in some cases there are imprecise objective probabilities. So for this, you have to generalize the axioms of probability. And, maybe something like the Schaefer-Vavik approach is one way of approaching that. Although I don't know that Glenn would go that route. So I just want to sort of broaden the conception. It's to the idea that we don't actually have to have objective probabilities in every case, and B, yeah, sometimes it might be that there's something systematic about a higher level description that makes it the case. And I haven't given you a definition, Yitzhak, but I'm sort of pointing in a certain kind of line of thinking. That's it.
Am I correct to understand that that David Lewis wanted there to be an objective probability for everything, or believed it, or that was part of the Humean project?
No, absolutely not. So Lewis explicitly said that there are only objective probabilities in indeterministic settings.
Oh, but could it be indeterministic and still not have an objective probability?
Yes.
So
I'm
among
reminded-
philosophers, let me, Clark, let me let you answer this, but what is the, can I ask a statistical question? How many philosophers think that there is an objective probability for all indeterministic events?
As many as can dance on the head of a pin.
Okay.
I was going to I seem to be the reminder here. Somewhere early on in the doctrine of chances, de Moivre observes that chance says nothing about what will happen. And our probability theory is largely asymptotic. Our statistical theory is largely asymptotic. And the questions that Gilboa raises are the urgent ones, and we don't have any answers. We don't even know quite what we're talking about in such cases.
Thank you, Clark. I want to go back to something that before we run out of time, and of course, I suppose we don't have to stop, though I may stop. I wanted to go back to something that Janan said. I took a note, and I think she said that well, I don't know how she said it, but I think you were saying that credences don't have to be about action or decision. But I had thought that that was the whole idea. I came into this story in the 1970s, and I had, as you may recall, I don't know, I had a book about what I called belief functions, which were degrees of belief, I called them, which didn't add up to 1 necessarily. And I was told that degrees of belief had to add up to 1, and that the reason was because you had this Dutch book argument, you had these decisions, you had to make a decision, and that that's why, and that it was all about Savage, and that's where credences came from, was all about decisions. And I thought that was what the philosophers were talking about when they said credence. I thought that was the starting point. I thought that was in stone. When did this change?
Should I answer that?
Well, yeah, I'm drinking it.
Okay, good. So, one thing that you might think is that subjective probabilities are descriptive of states of belief. And the way that you described, the way that what you said that Tip holds is that the only use for subjective probabilities is to combine them with utilities to make decisions that maximize subjective expected utility. the point that I was making was actually the relatively shallow one, that it seems to me, prima facie, that I have subjective degrees of belief that I can't connect to any possible decision.
And my question, maybe I should pose a question. Do they have to obey the rules of the probability calculus?
Yes, yeah.
Why? Why? What reason is there for that? Why can't you have beliefs like I had in my
I see what you're asking.
sixth book, where you have some degree of belief for something, but no degree of belief for the opposite? Why isn't that permitted if it's not a matter of betting rates that's what this was beat into me for 20 years, that I was wrong. My degrees of belief, these couldn't be credences or degrees of belief if they didn't follow the rules of the probability calculus.
I see what you're asking.
Now you switched on me. I mean, you weren't around then, so
Right.
but when did this change? That's my question. Okay, it's a rhetorical question. I see we have, but Sherry has raised her hand. Maybe
Yeah,
Sherry.
it's just on this point. Actually, there are non-pragmatic justifications for probabilism. So the Joyce-style accuracy arguments are like that. They appeal to accuracy, not your expected utility in decision making. So there are arguments that might allow for degrees of belief to have functions other than utility.
Require them to add up to 1, unlike mine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
James Joyce, I think it's
Oh, yes,
2009.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Who else had their hands up? I guess I see Stephen and Itchak. Are those new hands? And Snow, am I missing anybody?
No, sorry, my hand should have been taken down.
Oh, I see. Then maybe Itchak has something. What do you want to say?
So, yeah, just a few comments on what's been said. In terms of the necessity to act doesn't have to be necessarily here and now. Okay, when there's this discussion also of explanation versus prediction in science, and of course we do understand, we enjoy understanding, we enjoy being able to explain things, and we think about things that are not necessarily practical now. Probably the evolutionary reasons are that one day we might have to make a choice. But so I agree that there could be reasons to have beliefs that are not necessarily my decision now. My mind has been evolved to think about these things. On the other hand, I'm very much like Glenn in the position of dealing with non-additive, not necessarily additive probabilities. And I've found the Dutch book arguments not very convincing. For one, because both in betting and Dutch book, I mean, the very fact that someone comes back to you with this, if you're rational, you should have a model of everything, including why is this person coming back to me? Like Glenn has come back to me every time and is making an epsilon profit of me. At some point, I should wake up, right? I mean, so my model cannot be just about the 3 states of the world in which we are betting. At some point, my model should expand to include who is this guy and why is he waking me up? So these arguments also psychologically, I think they are actually quite weak. I do have to say that Savage is much more convincing. It's not about betting. You just read the axioms, and I'm telling the students, for 30 years that I've been teaching this every year, and I can't believe that my whole career is devoted to violations of these axioms. They're so compelling. But over the years we've written with some colleagues, we've written some papers and trying to understand where's the trick. And by and large, I'd say that the trick is in definition of the state space. If you do it right, if you try to solve also Newcomb's paradox, you define the state space as it should be, then you're very far cry from complete relation. But I think that the axioms, Savage's axioms, are not about actual betting or making money or IAD or anything like that. It's just look at them and say, wow, am I not this kind of person? And after a bit more thinking and maybe a bit more thinking on top of this, you say, okay, yeah, he was tricking me because he defined a state space that was huge, and then it made me think about an urn and balls, and this is where the trick was made. But I wouldn't go with the Dutch books. I think Dutch books are a very weak argument.
Does anybody want a last word? Maybe to make it finite, we should turn off the recording when it's 5:30 and let others continue the conversation if they want. So Sylvia, on the chat, did you want to make that comment, Sylvia? Sylvia Winmont.
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
that's fine. Yeah, I just wanted to mention that there is also this tradition started from Cox, a physicist, later followed by E.T. James. They tried to argue for probability, finitely additive probability, starting from Boolean algebras and basically trying to reason about that. And then you also get probabilities where necessarily, for instance, the probability of the negation also has to be defined. So that was just following up on the previous discussion.
Thank you. If for those who aren't familiar with the pros and or the pluses or the arguments for and against that, I will say that if you look on my list of publications, you'll find where I give my a couple of papers disagreeing with Cox, as well, of course, with Savage. So we have, yes, there are those arguments and there are counter arguments. Robin, do you have a last word?
I'd rather not say this is the last word, just a very minor comment on the point about non-additive probabilities. I have always thought that there's nothing incompatible between the use of IP or belief function to encode subjective probabilities versus being coherent in the betting sense.
I wanted to, if we're, it is 5:30 now, but I wanted to say to Itzhak, I was very struck that your description of the decision theory world was so distinct from the statistician's world. It's like data plays no role in that story. Could you make a general comment about that?
Yeah, I mean, it is surprising if you go back to the 50s and to Abraham Wald or something, and you say, what happened? I mean, these disciplines were supposed to go hand in hand, but I don't know. I mean, we could try to go into the sociology of this, but I think that decision theory has attracted many people who really like the beauty of it and were pretty far from things that had to do with actual empirical work. And so sometimes you also find people who are just fall in love with the beauty of arguments. And I found that some of my colleagues in economic theory are much purer than philosophers I talk to in terms of just falling in love with ideas. But it's really, sort of a very amateur sociological comment. I mean, the fact is that, yes, there's very little relationship, maybe in recent years with a little bit of the revealed preference literature, a little bit more, but by and large, it's a puzzle of how fields that were supposed to be so close and used to be close just took different paths.
Yeah. Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for coming and participating in this discussion. I learned some things, and I hope that many of you will want to return for our discussion next week of Philip David's ideas. Thank you very much. And let me thank the panelists especially. So,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.